The very first two practice sessions of the 2026 Formula One season are done in Melbourne. Ferrari topped the opening session with Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton, and Oscar Piastri put McLaren on top in the second session. But you already know the times. In this video, we are not reading the results, we are reading the story behind those results. What did Friday actually tell us about the new 2026 cars, about Mercedes, Ferrari, McLaren and Red Bull, and about the midfield? Let us break it down.
Everyone said Albert Park would be a real test for the new regulations. They were right. The 2026 cars have less aerodynamic grip, much more complex energy deployment, and active aero to manage. Albert Park has a lot of acceleration zones and a few slower corners where you really feel low downforce. That combination made the drivers look human again. On Friday, we saw repeated lock-ups into turn 3, wide moments at turn 10, and a lot of time lost in the lower speed corners as drivers tried to balance deployment and aero modes. Max Verstappen paid the heaviest price. He ran wide, damaged his floor on the gravel, and had to park a big part of his long-run plan. He was not alone. Many drivers could not complete clean race simulations on the harder tyres. Some went off, some got stuck in traffic, others were on completely different energy deployment plans. So if your impression from the timing sheets is that long-run data looks messy, that is because it is messy. And yet there are still some clear signals.
Mercedes did not chase headline laps on Friday. They did not go for glory runs at the top of the timesheets, but they did something much more important. They showed their race pace. In the second practice session, both George Russell and Kimi Antonelli put together calm, controlled, long stints on the hard compound tyre. On average race pace, George Russell was the benchmark. In the long-run data, he sits at the top of the list with an average lap in the low 1 minute 23 range on the hard tyre. Lewis Hamilton's Ferrari stint on the hard tyre was almost 0.7 of a second per lap slower than Russell's Mercedes run. Antonelli's stint for Mercedes sat very close to Russell, which confirms this is not a one-off lap, but a pattern. Yes, there is a big caveat. Ferrari's long runs in the second practice session were heavily interrupted, so we do not have a clear, full picture. But when your interrupted stint in a Ferrari already looks slower than a controlled Mercedes long run on the same compound, that is a warning sign. Even Charles Leclerc admitted it. After practice, he said that Mercedes is clearly very strong, especially in terms of race pace, and that Ferrari is lacking compared to them on longer runs. The big unknown is how much single lap speed Mercedes is hiding for qualifying. But in pure race trim, the early evidence is simple. Mercedes looks like the reference team over a stint.
On paper, Oscar Piastri's McLaren looked great on Friday. He topped the second session, and his long run on the soft tyre also looks respectable in the data. But there are two very important details. First, Piastri's stint was done on used soft tyres versus Russell's tyres on the hard compound. The conditions, the fuel load, and the purpose of the run were all different. Second, Lando Norris hardly had a clean long run on the same soft compound. Because of his gearbox issue in the first session, McLaren used the second session to give Norris mileage and confidence in the new car. They did a string of shorter runs on the hard tyre, probably with lower fuel to fast-track his learning curve. Those laps suggest that McLaren could dip below the 1 minute 23 mark on race runs, but the context is not clear enough to make a solid comparison to Mercedes. Red Bull is even harder to read. Max Verstappen's day was messy. He had a pit lane stall with the new power unit, he damaged his floor going off track, and he lost a big part of his planned race simulation. That leaves us mainly with Isack Hadjar's data on the medium compound. His average long-run pace sits behind Russell and Hamilton in the numbers, and Hadjar himself said that every lap in the second session felt difficult. The energy deployment and the balance of the car were not consistent from lap to lap. In other words, McLaren looks quick, but the fuel and tyre picture is blurred. Red Bull looks unsettled, and we probably have not seen its true potential yet. For now, Mercedes has shown the clearest, most repeatable race pace out of the top 4 teams.
If you tried to rank the midfield after Bahrain testing, you probably had something like Alpine, then Haas, then Racing Bulls, then Williams, then Audi, with all of them very close. Friday in Melbourne hinted at a slightly different picture. The big positive surprise was Audi. In its first year as a full constructor, Audi often sat in that bridge group between the top 4 teams and the rest of the midfield. Both Gabriele Bortoleto and Nico Hülkenberg put in solid qualifying-style laps. They were consistently in the middle of the timing screens. On race pace, Hülkenberg's long run on the medium compound was especially strong, sitting clearly ahead of Liam Lawson's Racing Bulls stint on the same tyre. Racing Bulls themselves looked sharp across both sessions, especially with Arvid Lindblad putting the car into the top 5 in the first session and the top 10 in the second. Alpine, however, was a mixed bag. The team came into Melbourne with a lot of optimism after spending most of its 2025 budget on the Mercedes-powered A526. In testing, Alpine looked reborn, but on Friday in Melbourne, single-lap pace was underwhelming. Pierre Gasly had a rough day with reliability problems and low mileage, and Franco Colapinto could not really show a top-of-the-midfield lap either. Gasly even said that Alpine is still fairly far from extracting maximum performance. The good news for Alpine is that its long-run pace on the medium tyre keeps it in the fight. Haas chose a different approach. In the long-run phase of the second session, it focused mainly on the hard compound, so we do not have a like-for-like medium tyre comparison. On paper, Haas looks about 0.3 of a second per lap behind Racing Bulls and Alpine. But the feeling is that once we normalise for tyre and fuel, Haas will be broadly on the same level as those two teams. Further back, Williams is currently on the lower end of that midfield pack. The car is known to be overweight, which is an instant penalty on lap time. On top of that, Alex Albon pointed to deployment issues as a major weakness. The drivers are struggling to keep the engine revs up through the lap, and that hurts both performance and energy regeneration. His long run in the data table is also one of the broken ones, with interruptions and inconsistent laps, and Carlos Sainz barely ran in the second session. So Williams' true pace might be slightly better than the raw numbers suggest, but there is clearly work to do. Cadillac is where you would expect a brand new operation to be, roughly a second or more off the midfield, not because of a disaster in performance, but because the focus for now is simply operational. Valtteri Bottas put together a decent medium tyre stint, but the team is still learning how to run a Grand Prix weekend together. Sergio Perez lost a lot of time with a suspected sensor issue and only managed a couple of laps. The data is too thin to judge them properly. Then there is Aston Martin. Their Friday was basically about survival. They only did 3 laps in the opening session and then had to use the second session to simply bed the car in. Communication issues between the battery and the control unit ruined 2 of the energy storage packs they brought to Australia. They are already short on usable hardware for the rest of the weekend. On top of that, they have been chasing vibration problems with the Honda power unit. In that context, outright pace on Friday is almost irrelevant for Aston Martin and for Cadillac. They just need a stable platform before they can even think about lap time. So, what did we truly learn from the first Friday of 2026? First, the new regulations have delivered exactly what we expected. Cars that move around more, drivers who make more visible mistakes, energy and aero systems that are tricky to optimize on day one. Second, Mercedes has sent a quiet but powerful message. Without topping the timesheets, it looks like the strongest race package in the field right now, with Russell and Antonelli both backing that up on long runs. Third, Ferrari, McLaren and Red Bull all have pace, but each has asterisks. Ferrari, interrupted long runs, and Leclerc openly pointing at Mercedes. McLaren, mileage split and tyre differences between Piastri and Norris. Red Bull, deployment issues, a broken floor, and very little clean data from Verstappen. Fourth, the midfield has shuffled. Audi and Racing Bulls look like the early surprises. Alpine and Haas are still very much in the mix, and Williams is paying for weight and deployment issues. Finally, for Cadillac and Aston Martin, Friday was less about pace and more about survival and systems. The real answers will only come on Sunday. But if you are looking for an early trend, right now Mercedes might have taken the sandbags off just enough to scare everybody else. Who do you think has the strongest race car after Friday, and which team is hiding the most ahead of qualifying? Let me know your predictions in the comments.